Hi, my name is Vanessa Page. I own the A1 website, which is www.ayeone.com. I primarily started machine embroidery and taught digitising. I then drifted into quilt making, and one of the things that I liked about this technique was I'm a person that if you can't do it yesterday, then I just don't do it. I'm a very quick person, so a lot of finicky detail I tend to avoid. Now also, when I started quilt making, I accumulated fat quarters, as we all do, but I tended to accumulate more than anybody else for the simple reason I visited one of the quilt stores and they had some fat quarter bags. In my wisdom, I decided that I didn't have enough fat quarters to fill that bag. So I decided to split up some of my meter fabric into fat quarters. Not a good idea for anybody that's starting off, because I then found that I needed meterage and all I had was fat quarters. So I was looking at different methods of using up these fat quarters. And this method of using these has become quite popular now at the retreats that I attend at different times of the year. I'll just show you some of the ideas. If you visited my website, you will have already seen a lot of these quilts. Now this is a very simple quilt. It's a fat quarter quilt, and the 4 panels that you can see are made up of 4 fat quarters. Some of the fabric from around the edge were other fabrics that either matched in or that I had in my fat quarter stash. And this is the actual quilt that I'll show you how to do to start with. This is the simplest one of the lot to do. Next I'm going to show you variations of quilts using the same technique. Similar sort of fabrics, but instead of being cut on square as the other fabrics were, these are all be cut diagonally and slashed across different ways in the fabric. Now you don't have to be spot on with this. There is no right or wrong way of slashing your fabric. Next one again is a very simple striped quilt. Again, all I did was cut up the fat quarters, but I cut them up in stripes this time. Then we have a combination of stripes and slashed pieces. Again, you've just got the 4 fat quarters and a bit of extra fabric for around the borders. This one doesn't have the sashing in the middle, so I've used one part of that slashed fat quarter to form a square in the centre, which is done on the diagonal. Going into your bright fabrics, this time I used 2 types of stripe cutting and then slashed across the stripes. And as I said, very bright fabric, and on the outside border you'll notice that I stripped some pieces together and then slash them diagonally as well. These are your petite type fabrics, and unless you actually look closely you really can't see where they've been slashed because the fabrics are very similar. Totally different way of slashing this fabric. Another simple one. Again, 4 fat quarters. This time I've added the pink to separate those squares up and use different fabrics for the borders and space the stripes on those borders. Another paler type of florals and leaves. Again, most of these quilts that I make are what I call lap quilts or wall hanging quilts. This is a very small one. This would be alright just to have a wall hanging. I also do these quilts for children. They're good little blankets to change nappies, etc. on. You're into the Japanese type fabrics, and this was another quilt that I did. Now you have to be careful when you pick out your fat quarters. You'll notice when you look at this quilt, the first thing that grabs you is that pale colour. So unless you want a distinct fabric to stand out, be careful how you do pick out your fat quarters. Again, This is another one using the technique that we're going to learn today, except I actually used a plain batik and then used some floral fabrics around. But that plain batik fabric will stand out within the other fabrics. Then I decided to play and to see what other sort of things I could do using this technique. I get bored and like to go on to different things. And I used the fat quarters in each corner. Then I used some wide strips of fabric and some narrower strips of fabric. But in the centre you'll notice that I have a flower, and that was just a flower that was printed onto fabric, and then I used that as the focal point on the quilt. Again, it gave it a different look to what I would normally be doing with these quilts. Even more adventurous, again with this one, I added piping around the border to split the borders away from those centre pieces of fabric. Then I had some fabrics that were bigger printed fabrics, view type fabrics, and I put this one together, and then I used the sashing in between and some piping to separate it up. And although I really didn't plan the quilt as such, it did give an interesting effect with the fact that they've got scenery in one of those blocks. Having done that, I then thought, well, maybe I could do 6 fat quarters rather than just keep doing 4 fat quarters. And another method, if you only want to use your 4 fat quarters, and some of the girls at the retreats asked me, is there any other different ways we could do things? So I said, okay, well, we'll slash it diagonally, and then we'll slash that. After we put it back together, we'll then slash it again, so that instead of having 4 pieces of your fat quarters, you're still using fat quarters, but you end up with 8 or more pieces within that fat quarter. So that is really interesting. And the bigger the fabrics, if you then wanted to go into using meters of fabric rather than a fat quarter of fabric, you can slash it as many times as you like and keep sewing it back together to split your fabric up. Finally, same technique that we're going to do today, but using 6 fat quarters and much wider borders. Now, I've had ladies that have made up king-size bed quilts that had meters of fabrics that they've then made into very large king-size or queen bed quilts. But this technique is so fast and it's foolproof because there's no specific way to do it. You can slash your fabric however you want. Now, this is the quilt that we're going to be doing, and as you can see, if you look into that area of the quilt, that is the fat quarter area, and you'll see 4 parts, which means 4 different fat quarters. And this is the simplest one of the lot because all you're doing is slashing in straight lines. Now, I have no sashing in between this one, but I have a darker border to accent the actual fat quarter area. And then I used some of the strips that were left over from, I had just a bit over a fat quarter just to fill in around this border area. Now, the quilt underneath is exactly the same slashing method. As you can see, it's just slashed straight lines, but I just put a thin sashing in between, and then I did some just bits and pieces down the side to make up my border to use up some more of my scrap fabrics. Now, there is no set way on how you slash that area.